So I have to be honest, I'm quite delighted to have the honor of welcoming everyone here today. Not only are there students here, but also my former colleagues from EPRI, in addition to a lot of new colleagues that I'm delighted to have the chance to meet. Not only that, but I'm welcoming you all to a really, really important topic, global nuclear energy. The topic and discussion of today's panel is critical to engage our students in global policy analysis. Our program, if you're not familiar with it, is Energy, Resources, and Environment, and we prepare students for the workforce by training them and enabling them to have interdisciplinary skills that allow them to tackle global problems at the cusp of energy, economy, and the environment. And understanding the risks and benefits of nuclear power is essential to global policy today. As global emissions continue to rise, nuclear energy provides a low-carbon source of electricity that is recognized for its potential to contribute to climate solutions, but also to questions about energy security and national security across nations and countries. At the same time, the world is facing an aging fleet, such as the fleet here in the United States, which is 20% of generation, in addition to unfavorable economics and public perception issues in many regions. It is for these reasons that it's critical for our students to be engaged in not only recognizing these challenges, but also developing solutions with all of you. As a result, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our students, our guests, and this excellent panel of highly distinguished experts to discuss opportunities and challenges that are emerging with this sector. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it along to Mr. Rashek Rahman to introduce our panel.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the AE2C board, my name is Rashek Rahman. I'm the secretary of the board, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. AE2C is a unique organization, I think the only one of its kind in the United States that brings together Asian Americans and as well as like-minded professionals to work on and discuss issues of cross-cultural importance and policy, business, economics around the world with a particular focus on Asia. And we're very lucky today for today's panel to have a very diverse group of folks speak on the issues and the future of nuclear energy. We're also privileged today to have one and possibly two members of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The commissioners, Mr. Stephen Burns is here representing, and we've gotten messages from Mr. David Wright as well. So we're very excited to have such a group, and I'm sure there'll be a number of SCI students coming in during the program for a full house. So with that, I also wanted to say that for those of you who don't know about AE2C, we definitely recommend you go to our website, learn more about us, come to future events, join as a member. We do about an event once every quarter around different topics of interest, bringing together folks in our network. Janice is a longtime member of AE2C and has kindly given her time to help organize this event and bring her network of folks to this event. And so we welcome all of those, as is her supportive husband, Stephen, who's always a booster for our events. So with that, let me briefly introduce Janice, and I'll have Janice introduce the panel. And of course, all of you should have programs, so the full details are there. Janice Don Lee was the Deputy Director General, Head of the Department of Management at the International Atomic Energy Agency. She was appointed to the position in January 1st, 2012, and served a 5-year term in sunny Vienna, Austria. She has more than 40 years of experience in the nuclear policy and regulatory fields. Before assuming her position at IEA, she was the Director General of the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency in Paris, France, and previously was the Director of the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission, Office of International Programs. During her time in the nuclear policy field, she participated in the negotiation completion of the U.S.-China Agreement for Cooperation, Section 123, as required by the Atomic Energy Act, which meant she led negotiations to establish a safety framework between U.S. and Chinese regulatory authorities, representing the U.S. in many bilateral and multinational forums. So I can't really think of someone more qualified to lead this panel today. So with that, Janice, please join us.
Sorry.
Nice to meet you.
I think we met before. Thank you. Just walking over here.
Okay, so can people hear me? Great. Okay, so they told me that I would have to use the handheld mic where everybody else has one on their lapel, which is more of an advantage, but I said I would be happy to hold it, but then I have to manipulate my notes and the thing, so bear with me, please. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first event this fall of the AE2C. I'm really pleased and happy to welcome and introduce our panel of speakers and serve as the moderator for this discussion. Given my background as a former regulator and senior official in two international organizations, the Nuclear Energy Agency in Paris and the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, AE2C asked me to help plan and organize this meeting to discuss the status of nuclear power in the global context. It's a pretty timely topic and one that is of keen interest to me given my 40-year career in the nuclear business. As many of you here, we have seen the ebbs and flows of the industry throughout the years. Starting at the beginning, the US has been dominant and prominent in both reactor designs and regulatory fields, and highly respected in the international community. Through the history of commercial nuclear power plant operations, we witness three major accidents, two occurring in very well-developed countries, the United States and Japan, and the other in Ukraine. And we've all seen the severe impact that these accidents have had on the future of nuclear power. We've lived through what we call the so-called nuclear renaissance, when things were looking pretty promising in terms of new builds worldwide based on high energy demand, higher prices of alternative fuels at that time, demand for lower carbon sources, licensing reform underway with one-step licensing, financial incentives to those willing to take the risk associated with building new plants, and even a possible solution for nuclear waste disposal. So what happened? In the last decade, we've had the financial crisis, the Fukushima Daiichi accident, and cheaper alternative fuel sources. Renewables have become more affordable, natural gas is cheaper, and in the US, they're talking about coal again. I recall a time when all plants in the US were requesting and approved for plant life extension from 40 to 60 years. Now we are seeing early plant closures, primarily due to economic reasons. We also seem to have forgotten how to build nuclear power plants. New plant construction has become a first-of-a-kind project, so we experience cost overruns and delays in construction. No doubt, it appears that nuclear energy faces an uncertain future, at least in the US, struck by fierce competition, failure to deliver projects on time and on budget, and a weary public that's sensitive to operational safety. From an international perspective, it's disconcerting for me to hear that China, in about 12 years, will have more reactors than in the United States, which now totals about 100. This is a stunning and jaw-dropping development. We have always had the most operating reactors in the world, and the prestige that follows. Countries look to the US for operational experience, a strong regulatory body, and a robust market for reactor and fuel sales overseas. I remember the time when I was at the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, head of the Office of International Programs, and I worked on the Agreement for Cooperation between the US and China, which, as you heard, took more than 15 years to negotiate. It was a career highlight for me to sign the export license, which would provide China with the Westinghouse AP1000 design in 2007, which was right before I left for Paris. As a Chinese American, I was very proud to be part of this historic opportunity for the US and China to cooperate on a new reactor design and build what would now become the basis for the next fleet of reactors in China. So while the US is experiencing early shutdowns and plant closures, China's nuclear program has taken off, as well as other countries such as India. In addition, we are seeing an aggressive Russian Federation continuing to build in their own country, along with an expansive outreach to countries wanting nuclear power. And I'm talking about countries like Belarus, Jordan, Vietnam, Turkey, Bangladesh, and Egypt. Climate impacts are intensifying by the day, and we hear that the global nuclear sector must do more to position itself in the climate fight. Shouldn't we care about this and the contribution that nuclear makes? And what about the investments in human capital? I recently returned from my third annual visit to the Russian Federation to conduct a workshop on human capital development for Rosatom employees interested in working in international organizations, primarily the IAEA. For those of you who don't know Rosatom, it's like the Ministry of Energy. It's a little bit like our Department of Energy. This idea was conceived at the highest levels of Rosatom in an effort to enhance placement of more Russians at the IAEA to be more influential on a number of fronts involving nuclear. Obviously, they see this as a way to influence markets and policy. They have a long-term vision of grooming Russian citizens to be placed in a variety of positions. This is an investment in people. Having worked in international activities in the United States my whole career, I recall painfully the struggle to convince top levels of government on the value of international experiences and collaboration. Another recent data point for me is Canada, believe it or not. In my retirement, I consult for the World Nuclear University Summer Institute, which brings about 75 future leaders from all over the world for 6 weeks of technical and leadership training in nuclear. And in fact, I have one of my mentees who's in the audience today. For the past 2 summers, the Canadians have sent a record number of fellows, 14 to be exact, each year to attend the program. The United States government sends 0. So what does this say about where we place value in terms of human resource development? The decline of the U.S. nuclear power sector ability to compete raises several concerns. Nuclear power abroad is viewed as an area where the U.S. is commercially ceding ground. It is difficult to keep pace with research and facilities to conduct the needed research for advanced technologies. And we need to closely examine the relationship between a domestic nuclear industry and the U.S. national security interests. So we're going to talk a little bit about this today. We could actually talk about each one of those things for an hour each at a time, but we don't have that much time. And I've asked our distinguished panel to talk about the challenges and solutions of the U.S. nuclear energy sector, what this means for the U.S. electricity markets, U.S. technological competitiveness, the impact of burdensome regulations, and U.S. national security interests. And I'm pleased to introduce the following individuals who represent government, industry, and think tank. We have on my far right, Amy Roma, who I met through the Nuclear Titan program. And I have another Nuclear Titan on this panel, who's Rita Barenwal, which is something that you should all listen to if you're really interested in nuclear. These are really people who have stellar careers, and they've been asked to talk about their careers and their work, and it's really insightful. But Amy is a partner at Hogan Lovells in Washington, D.C., and she's the co-author of a fantastic report called Back from the Brink: A Threatened Nuclear Industry Compromises National Security. To my immediate right is Ho Ni, who's the former head of the safety division at the Nuclear Energy Agency. We were not there at the same time, but he subsequently rented my apartment along with Steve Burns. And we have a great story to tell about that. We call it the lucky apartment, okay? But Ho just returned to come back to the US NRC to head up the Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation. So very pleased to see you, Ho.
Thank you.
And to my immediate left is George Gelling, who's a Senior Vice President of Exelon. He's responsible for licensing and regulatory matters. And to my far right is Dr. Rita Barenwall, representing Idaho National Laboratory and Director for the Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear. We look forward to what you have to say. And I'm going to ask George to begin. As a utility executive, is it really all about cost?
No. Clearly, nuclear energy is key to this country, and it's really important that the nuclear power industry remains strong, such that we maintain the skills and knowledge for all nuclear endeavors. Let's talk a little bit about the benefits of nuclear. First off, 56% of the energy generated is carbon. Of all the carbon generation, 56% is generated by nuclear. By far, the largest portion. If you think about it, without that 56%, it would be very hard for us to make any climate change goals. Also, when you look at nuclear, our fuel is on site. Once we load the reactor up, typically it's 1.5 to 2 years of fuel on site. We don't have to rely on a pipeline. We don't have to rely on a barge. We don't have to rely on the wind. We don't have to rely on the sun. That fuel is on site. Of all the generation resources, it's the most secure. We essentially have a paramilitary workforce. It's a large part of our workforce that protects that plant. From a cybersecurity, we're very well positioned. We've installed mitigation and protection such that none of our safety systems are connected or interfaced with the internet. We're all air-gapped. So when you look at nuclear, it's critical to carbon-free generation. It's safe, it's reliable, 94% capacity. No other industry can beat that one. And all our fuel's on site and it's secure. So what's our challenge? Quite frankly, economics is our biggest challenge. The price of gas has just made our markets very, very challenging. When you look at what has caused some of the nuclear power plants to shut down, you have a state like Nebraska. I would say Nebraska has got more wind. It's almost similar to Saudi Arabian oil. They have more wind than they can deal with it, and that's why Fort Calhoun was no longer competitive. Then you go to another state like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has more natural gas than they know what to do with, so they are going to be very focused on natural gas. But then you go to the state of Maryland, no natural gas. I don't think too many people are going to build a wind farm in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, maybe off the coast of Ocean City. But again, there are other states like Maryland, New Jersey, the Northeast that are really challenged with their energy resources and really rely on nuclear energy, and nuclear energy can be a key for them going forward. But what are we going to do about the future? As far as the power company goes, we believe that the most important thing we can do is operate our plants with operational excellence. We cannot afford another TMI. We cannot afford a Fukushima or the like. So we do a lot to make sure we operate our plants with operational excellence. And we're very fortunate in that we work with HONE and Nuclear Regulatory Commission to really look at the regulations and make sure they keep up and are modernized as the technology and what we know about from operating experience about what we learn about how to operate the plant well, that the regulations keep up with that. But where do we really have to go when you talk about cost? Most nuclear power plants in general is about $30 a megawatt. To be competitive with gas, we got to get down to about $25 a megawatt. Can we do that? We absolutely can, and a lot of companies are figuring out how to do that right now. It's mostly based on innovation, and really three areas. First, there's accident-tolerant fuel. It makes the reactors less susceptible to fuel failures. It also allows us to increase our burnup, which helps with fuel economy, and could also lengthen fuel cycles. Another avenue is digital. We have found that upgrading these plants, a lot of these plants are quite old, experienced. I don't know how to use the old word. But what we found is these plants are very, very basic. And as we go from analog system to digital systems, that's part of the reason why the capacity factor is so high. We've just done, that technology has helped us tremendously with improving capacity factor, improving safety, and all kinds of benefits. And last but not least, innovation. Our ability to analyze big data helps us do preventive maintenance in a much more efficient way, make sure we're putting our resources on the most safety and production important equipment, and make sure our resources are focused where they need to be. Similar to the airline industry, we aim for the same type of reliability as the airline industry. So, you know, what's the future really hold? I do believe nuclear plays a key role. I think it's very, very important for this country to have a diverse power supply. Nuclear has got to play a key role in that. I believe it should be in the 20 to 30% of that mix. I do think there is a role for gas, wind, and hydro and solar, but we need all of them. I think I've read some of the press recently as to why GE stock here recently dropped. You find that one of their new turbine lines has developed a crack in one of the first stages of their turbine. So they've had several companies, including Exxon, have had to shut their plants down until they solve this problem. So it just brings to the fore that we all need to have a diverse energy supply, both from the technological viewpoint and from the resource viewpoint. So, in my mind, more the better, and the more well-balanced that is, the better off we'll be. That will help us maintain the skills and knowledge going forward, essentially to get to the next two generations of reactors. The next generation of reactors is going to be probably the small modular reactor. It's inherently safe. Their safety systems are very passive and much fewer safety systems in general. Well, what does that mean to us? Number one, a whole lot of regulatory focus and a whole lot fewer systems that need to be safety related, which is costly. Also, our emergency planning zones. Presently, most emergency planning zones are a 10-mile radius around the plant. And what we believe going forward is that emergency planning zone will be just around the plant itself. And what that means is we've looked at and determined in any accident, there won't be a radiological release of significance past the site boundary. That helps us significantly in reducing costs and not having to have emergency evacuation plans that impact the public and the like. And secondarily, that reduces the size of the security staff we have at our nuclear power plants. Believe it or not, in the next couple of years, that security staff is going to be the largest staff on site. So that's our next step. That should be a bridge, and eventually we need to get to breeder reactors where we close the fuel cycle. I believe one day that technology will be out there and it will occur. It probably won't be in my lifetime, but I hope one of you smart folks out there will figure it out. But it really is going to be all about innovation, and that's our view of what the future should hold. So thank you.
Thank you very much, George. We will have some time for Q&A probably at the end of the session, so I'd ask you to just hold off for a little bit, but think about your questions, because we have all these experts up here, and I'd really love you to challenge them. The next speaker is going to be Ho Ni from the U.S. NRC, and he's going to talk a little bit about the current state of nuclear regulation, touch maybe a little bit on licensing of new technologies, including the SMR. So, Ho?
Okay, thank you, Janice, and appreciate the invitation. I'd like to thank AE2C for the opportunity to be here. Let me first talk a little bit about the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I know there are a lot of people in the room that are very familiar with the NRC. We have a commissioner sitting in the audience as well, but I know there's some students there, and I think it's just helpful for you to understand what the NRC is and how we do our job. We are an independent regulatory agency. We're independent from all the departments of the administration, and we're responsible to essentially the American people, and we have oversight through the Congress. And we are funded through fees that are charged to our licensees. So I want to just point that out. We're independent, but the cost of doing our independent regulatory job is 90% of it is paid by the industry that we regulate. So I want to make that distinction. And I want to say that because the NRC is not a promotional agency. The Department of Energy does a lot of the promotional work in developing nuclear technologies in the United States, and as well as doing work around the world. So as far as whether or not nuclear energy will have a role in the future in the United States energy mix, it's not directly a decision that the NRC is involved with. Having said that, how we do our job can have an indirect effect on whether or not nuclear can be a viable option for the country in combating things like climate change and things of that nature. So I just wanted to give you that perspective in case you didn't know about the NRC. What I'd like to do before getting into some of these topics, such as innovation and technologies, I want to just share with you some perspectives I took away after a little over 3 years working at the Nuclear Energy Agency, as Janice mentioned. And in that capacity at the NEA, I was responsible for nuclear safety regulatory cooperation with a number of different countries, including some of the ones you mentioned, China. We were trying to establish a closer relationship with China. Of course, Russia was involved. We called Rosatom the mothership. But other regulators in Europe as well. I was also responsible for safety research activities, looking at very, very technical research experimental programs. And also I was involved with new reactor regulatory reviews. So some of the new designs that are being built around the world, I was doing some work in that area. And I'll give you a few perspectives. I'll boil it down to three. The first one I would say is that when I first arrived in 2015, the conversation amongst the international nuclear safety community was all about post-Fukushima measures, what was done to make power plants safer. By the time I left in 2018, the conversation was all about economics and how nuclear can be a part of climate change. I mean, it really shifted that much. And what I would say is that for most of the countries, at least in the NEA framework, most of the countries are facing the same issues that are being faced here in the United States, where nuclear operators are facing competition, whether it's with low-cost natural gas or subsidized renewables, and that's putting pressure on the nuclear operators. So some of the state-owned programs, such as China and Russia, obviously don't have those type of forces acting on them. So I just wanted to make that point that this phenomenon that Janice and George were talking about isn't isolated to the United States. The second thing that I took away was that among the international community, particularly in the government regulatory bodies, there was really a strong sense of growing enthusiasm to welcome innovation and technology in existing nuclear power plants. So I saw several regulators that were very, I would say, progressive in trying to find ways to license new technologies in their existing power plants, as well as looking for ways to develop nuclear technologies. And I think the NRC is doing some of that as well, and I'll talk about that momentarily. The last observation I would share is that the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission is really viewed as a respected leader in the international community. And I think that's really important. A lot of it was driven by how competent the NRC staff are that come to these international activities. I mean, they are really viewed as regulatory experts. I was asked by the Japanese Nuclear Regulation Authority to run a workshop for their organization because they were going through regulatory reform after Fukushima, and they're adopting the US NRC's reactor oversight process, our inspection program. Japan's going to adopt pretty much most of it. So, they're really looking at the NRC's expertise to help them be successful in transitioning to a new program. And I've heard, just working with my international peers, especially when we were looking at, what type of research projects or activities to follow up on, many countries would say, wow, let's see what the NRC does, because if it's not that important to the NRC, it must not be that important. So I think the United States has an influential voice in the international community, and I think we still need to be part of this conversation internationally. As Janice pointed out, there are countries that are growing very rapidly, and I think for countries that are new to nuclear as well as countries that are expanding, having the different regulatory approaches to safety and having that information shared and discussed is a healthy thing, because our approach in the United States to nuclear safety regulation is quite different than the rest of the world. We have what we call very, very prescriptive requirements where the rules are spelled out with a lot of detail. And other countries have more high-level performance-based requirements. They also have other mechanisms where they periodically review the safety of a plant every 10 years and essentially issue a brand new license. We don't do that. We have inspectors on site all the time. So for that reason, given that there's differences in how to make sure plants are safe, I think it's really important that the NRC stays at the table in the international community. So going to the domestic picture here, we talked a little bit about technology and innovation. There is an effort at the NRC. We're calling it now this effort to transform. It's, I mean, you can look at it as sort of going from a caterpillar to a butterfly. It may not exactly be that way, but we are going to do things a lot different than some folks like Rich in the audience who are very familiar with from a long time ago. We're doing things differently, and what I came to find, I've only been back in my job 1 month, but the comment I heard so much in the hallways were, when I was having conversations, oh, well, while you were away. I mean, we're really doing things that are quite different than what I remember. I started out as a resident inspector back in the 90s, and I can say what we're doing today is quite different, and I'm really encouraged by it. For example, we are becoming more risk-informed as a regulator. Okay, and what that means is we are taking insights from probabilistic risk assessment methods and other methodologies that give us a picture of what are the activities and what are the issues at a nuclear power plant that can challenge safety the most in terms of public protection. And those are the issues we want to focus on, as opposed to focusing on issues that are determined based on just engineering judgment and other methods that aren't based on probabilistic risk assessment. So it's really trying to blend these two types of decision-making methodologies together. One that's informed by probabilistic risk assessment, where we understand all, what can go wrong, how likely is it, and what are the consequences. This is more of the risk type approach versus the engineering type traditional criteria, such as preventing a big break in the reactor coolant system piping, making sure that you have two sources of electrical power, and some of the just basic what we call deterministic criteria. So we're trying to become more risk informed, and we're doing that because if we're spending time on issues that really matter most towards safety, that's a good thing. Okay, that's an effective use of our resources, and in turn, that will cause licensees like George at Exelon to focus their resources on the things that matter most. And what we're trying to not do now is spend too much time on issues that don't add value to safety. And frankly speaking, we've done that before in the past. And I think a lot of people at NRC recognize that there have been some just lower level issues that we find in the inspection program or through other operational experience that in the end, if we spend 10 years looking at it, there's maybe not so much we're going to be able to do to make the plants that much safer. So we're trying to do less of those types of things and focus more on the activities that really impact safety the most. And it's going to be a culture shift for some people. So that's one area. The other area we're looking at, I know George mentioned accident-tolerant fuels. The fuel vendors are looking at developing and using fuels that can have better performance during accident conditions. They can operate at lower temperatures during normal operations. Again, they can produce higher power outputs, which can give operational flexibility to licensees, which ultimately end up better for them financially, I would say. From our perspective, we think this is a good thing because it's going to improve safety. I mean, if you have a fuel type that's used in a core that, again, can give an operator more time to take actions or to put equipment into service during an accident condition, from a regulatory point of view, that's a good thing. So I want my staff to be able to get the research that needs to be obtained to be able to qualify these types of fuels so we can use them. And I used to give this talk internationally, and I put up a sign that's in front of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, and it said, the last line of that sign, don't quote me on this, but this is what I remember. It says, events that happened here will have caused basic changes throughout the nuclear industry. And from my perspective, a basic change is putting fuel in that can withstand higher temperatures during an accident, but that change hasn't happened yet. But we're trying to make that happen, and I think the NRC is really doing its work more efficiently toward that end. In terms of advanced reactor licensing, this morning I was just meeting with the team at NRC to look at what we're doing to get ready for advanced reactor licensing. I'll go a little bit technical here, but in our regulations, those prescriptive regulations I mentioned, there are a lot of them, and they're all based on what we call light water technology. So the nuclear power plants operating today use water to cool the plant, and let's just leave it at that. Some of the advanced reactors don't use water, they use gas, like helium, or they have fuel that's already melted in liquid metal. I mean, it doesn't sound like that. I mean, it sounds really cool, but it's not that interesting. It's not like the Terminator or anything like that. but it's like, you know, liquid sodium or fluorine or something like that that has fuel already in it. But our rules were not based on those types of reactor designs. So what we're doing now is really looking at what type of framework we need to have to be ready to license this type of technology if the country decides that nuclear could be a part of it. So what's encouraging about that is that we're doing it now before the applications are coming in. So I'm really happy about that we're spending some resources to develop the framework. Again, if there's a commercial demand for these reactors, that we'll be in a good position to have an efficient licensing process there. Digital, I mean, yeah, hopefully you got the picture in talking with George. I mean, yeah, they're old, mature, we can say it that way. You know, you go into these control rooms, it's push button dials and switches, but the new plants, such as AP1000, they're fully digital. What is interesting to me is that the NRC was able to license AP1000 with a digital control system, but yet the existing plants we're struggling with doing that. But we're getting better. We've given improved guidance to the industry on how to bring more digital systems into the existing nuclear power plant. So it's an area we're trying to improve upon. And again, from the industry's perspective, if you can have better systems to control the plant, it's a cost savings for you. So we see our role at the NRC is in terms of how can we enable this technology to come into the plant safely so that, again, you can perform better. Because again, I would argue that you need technological innovation for safety. It's necessary because if your digital or if your old equipment is no longer available, it's obsolete. To me, that's not a good thing. So we want to be able to modernize and upgrade the plants, especially if we're looking at, you know, longer periods of operation. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Janice. Yep.
Thank you very much, Ho. I'm so happy that you're back and in this position. You seem very suited for it. It's a great promotion and honor for me to know that, you know, you've stepped into this, and it's really great that you're back. Thank you.
Welcome.
Now we're going to turn to Rita, who will tell us about innovation. How are we exploring solutions to new reactor designs?
Okay, great.
Rita, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for showing up towards the end of the day. I appreciate it. A little background about me. Based on the fact that I'm wearing red boots on a panel, you can probably guess I'm not very conventional. And that has served me very well in the role that I'm currently in, but I think has also helped me get to this point. Back in college and grad school, I studied material science and engineering. And the nuclear industry was a very huge unknown to me. I applied to a headhunter who found me a position at this place called Bettis Atomic Power Laboratory. This was right around the time when the internet was just starting up. I tried to do a search on this company, could find nothing about them. I walked into the interview and said, I'm really sorry, I have no idea what you guys do. I tried to do my homework, but I couldn't find anything. And they said, that's okay, that's how we like it. Bettis Atomic Power Lab, for those that do not know, is a government laboratory that does design, development, and maintenance of the nuclear reactors for the United States Navy's aircraft carriers and submarines. So that is where I started my professional career after graduate school. I worked on advanced fuel for them, and that's all I can tell you. But going with the theme of unconventional behavior, I actually did some of my experiments at midnight so as not to cause too much disruption with the other lab mates that I had, because some of the stuff I was doing was kind of stinky, literally. And so the reason why I share with you where I started my career was one of the most memorable opportunities I had was to go to Newport News shipyard. And at that time, the USS Ronald Reagan was being built. And I got the opportunity to stand in the cavity where the reactor was going to go. And I stood there and I looked up several stories and I realized that the fuel that I worked on, little itty bitty fuel, powered or was going to power this entire enormous behemoth of an aircraft carrier. And that was really the turning point for me in my career where I realized this is where I want to be. I'm working on something that has such energy density. It can move this ship. And yet I'm doing this work in a little laboratory. So I came for the energy density. That's point one. Fast forward 10 years, I am now working at Westinghouse at their fuel fabrication facility, where they fabricate the fuel that is responsible for 10% of the electricity in the United States. That's a pretty big deal. And I realized, and along that way, by the way, I became a mother, have 2 kids now. Along the way, I had done a lot of world traveling, and every time I would come back to the States, I'd realize this air is very clean. I can breathe it. It doesn't remind me of a certain smell. I can't wipe soot off my face. And so now I'm in this business because of the clean energy that nuclear provides. And George mentioned nuclear is responsible for almost 60% of the CO2 emission-free energy that's generated in the United States. And so to me, that's a big deal. So that's why I stay. In respect to, in regards to innovation, I am the director of GAIN, which is the Department of Energy Initiative. It stands for Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear. And some of the reasons that GAIN was launched was that it takes a long time to do research and development in this industry. By show of hands, how many of you have done any research in the nuclear industry? How many of you have commercialized something in the nuclear industry? Okay, so for those that can't see, it's like 1 or 2 hands that stayed up. It is really difficult. It takes a lot of resources, both financial, intellectual, and time. And so the DOE realized this and said, well, we've got crown jewels in our arsenal. We can give folks access to the national lab capabilities. We can give them access to our world-renowned experts. We can give them access to our reactors. We can give them access to our historical data so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. And that is why GAIN was launched. And so what GAIN does is provide private advanced nuclear technology developers, so that's private industry. It gives them access to the national lab capabilities with respect to technical resources, some financial resources, so we have a voucher program where you can get some funds to do work at the labs, and then also some regulatory guidance. We have a memo of understanding with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission wherein we communicate with NRC about upcoming changes in licensing that are occurring in the advanced reactor space, as well as informing the NRC about what's going on in our community with respect to what the private industry developers are working on. And so we've opened that line of communication. There are public stakeholder meetings every 6 weeks at the NRC. So if you're interested, you can call in, you can walk in and participate and listen in. They've been very robust over the past, I'd say, past year or so. We've had full agendas every single meeting. We've taken in a lot of feedback from private industry and passed it back on to DOE to the point where just last December, they launched a industry-focused funding opportunity announcement. It is open for 5 years, and deadlines are every quarter, wherein a private industry can apply for funding of the DOE to either further their technology, to start to work with the NRC in terms of the regulatory process, or to start to deploy their technology. DOE initially expected to fund for FY18 this opportunity at $60 million, and they are actually on track to fund it at $100 million. So that is really good news when the government can over-deliver on a promise. So those are some of the things that we're doing to change the way that we do business in this industry. DOE has certainly kind of turned the tables and said industry needs to lead and we will support. And they have been very supportive of making sure that industry can commercialize their technology faster and more cost effectively by using government resources.
Thank you very much, Rita. It's great to see somebody with your background running a program like this. It's quite unusual to see women in these, technical nuclear fields, and I'm always so proud to, when I run into one that, speaks authoritatively and can represent that industry in the way that Rita does. So thank you for joining us. Now I'm going to turn to Amy, another stellar nuclear titan, I would say. She is going to talk about the subject of national security. I have a question for you. Can we get back from the brink? Okay, that was such a fascinating report. I think Amy has brought copies of that report for all of you to take away. It's not long, it's about 20 pages, but it's really, really worthwhile reading. We've lost many of our nuclear offerings in the world, and I'm wondering, can we regain ground? So, Amy, love to hear from you.
Thanks, Janice. And if anybody's looking for one, I brought about 25 copies, which is all I could physically carry. So Janice is generous in saying it's not long, it's only 20 pages, because it's kind of double that, but a lot of footnotes. So if there's any students here who are doing research papers, you can borrow some of the research that I've done and use some of my footnotes, but there is a robust executive summary. So I'm here, by way of background, I'm a lawyer. I'm a nuclear regulatory lawyer. I have not traveled as much as Rita has. I have gone from Rockville, where I started my career at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to downtown DC. But what that has brought me when I moved to an international law firm is I have worked with every aspect of the nuclear industry you can imagine, from uranium mining to uranium enrichment to large-scale utilities to advanced reactors, advanced fuels, fuel fabricators, decommissioning companies, and I have worked with countries that are looking at developing new nuclear programs. So I have seen it all from a very unique perspective. I'm a lawyer, so people come to me with their problems. So what I've seen from my perspective are the problems that have been arising in the nuclear industry for the last 15 years of my career. And maybe the best way to shape that for this audience, understanding that you guys probably come from diverse backgrounds, is maybe telling it in the form of a story, from where we started to where we are now to where we're going based on our current trajectory. So where did we start? The commercial nuclear power industry and national security were tied together from the very beginning. In 1954, the first commercial nuclear power reactor was built in Shippingport, Pennsylvania, and that provided power to the grid. That same year, the USS Nautilus was launched. Both programs were overseen by the US government under Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was the founder of the nuclear navy. Both programs used technology that originated in national labs, and the technologies that were used both on nuclear-powered submarines and in the commercial nuclear reactors were the same type of technology, light water reactor technology that has been deployed to 80% of nuclear power plants that are in use around the world today. So why does that matter? So at that time, the US had just used a nuclear weapon. The world was very scared that nuclear weapons were going to expand. And in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower gave what's called the Atoms for Peace speech. He stood up and said, you know what? if the world decides to forgo building nuclear weapons, we will share commercial nuclear power technology with you. And there was a very calculated decision in doing that. If we did not do it, other countries would. Notably, Russia, who was right behind our heels in developing nuclear weapons, also had the capability of sharing technology. And if Russia was the one that shared the technology, the United States would lose the story. We'd lose the ability to shape the nonproliferation discussion, the safety and security discussion, and to exert the geopolitical influence that went with providing power to foreign countries. And so the three common themes we'll see with where we came from, where we're going, and where we're today, from a national security perspective, are threefold. It's 1, geopolitical influence, 2, nonproliferation, and 3, the ties with the US military, namely the nuclear navy. Since the Atoms for Peace speech and since the shipping port reactor, the US went on to build, we have about almost 100 nuclear power plants operating in the United States. I think there's 450 some odd nuclear reactors operating abroad. And nuclear power continues to expand, particularly abroad. So where are we right now? Well, in the United States, we see a number of our operating nuclear power plants shutting down, largely for economic reasons. The price of natural gas went down very low. Nuclear power is not compensated for what I would call its externalities, for the non-carbon emissions that it produces, its national security benefits, and other benefits it has. And so it's unable to compete kind of in that current climate. And once a nuclear power plant shuts down, it's gone. You don't just mothball it, set it aside, and wait for economic situations to change. It is done. You start to pull it apart. And so we're seeing in the United States, nuclear power plants are shutting down. With that, we lose our supply base. So there's nuclear power plants provide, thousands and thousands of jobs. But there's also the supply chain that goes with that. There's the Westinghouses of the world. There's the companies that do the fuel fabrication, the supply, the contractors. We've already seen, in order to make nuclear fuel in the United States, there's a whole series of steps from the time you mine the uranium out of the ground until you put it in a reactor. One of those is a conversion facility. We've already seen one of those shut down. The United States has one uranium enrichment facility, but it's foreign origin technology and foreign owned and cannot be used for military purposes. So our nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers can't be powered by uranium that was enriched in the commercial nuclear enrichment facility. And so we have this degraded ability to manufacture fuel in the United States. We have more and more suppliers going out of business. They're having less and less work to do. And as a risk that's associated with that, we can see less students who are studying nuclear engineering decide to go in and pursue a career either in the nuclear navy or in the nuclear power industry as a result of that. And what are we seeing abroad? Well, abroad, the picture does not look so grim, except it does for the United States. If you're Russia, it's looking pretty good for you right now. In 2017, Rosatom announced that it has $133 billion in orders lined up for new nuclear reactors. $133 billion. The US equivalent of that, 0. So Russia's making out like a bandit on the international market. And it's building those reactors, I think, in upwards of 19 countries. So what happens in those 19 countries? Well, those 19 countries go to Russia, and Russia builds their reactors, not the United States. Russia sets the security standards and the safety standards. It's not the United States. And we slowly start to see that the safety and security standards that have come out of the United States that are doing such an extraordinary job slowly begin to erode. And the US voice on those matters slowly begins to erode as well, because we just won't have the capabilities in our domestic experience to back up the voice that we want to have abroad. And so while we do see a lot of activity internationally, and a lot of them are in strategic areas, they're in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, those reactors aren't being built by us right now. And so with advanced reactors, and I'm going to end on a happy note for everybody who thinks I'm being depressing and I'm scaring you. So So with advanced reactors, we have approximately 75 new business ventures in the United States that are looking at developing advanced reactors. Holy cow, advanced reactors have an extraordinary potential. But one of two things can happen right now. They either find a US customer and they are able to deploy in the United States, or they move overseas. Well, actually, one of three things happens. They either find a customer, they move overseas and develop abroad, or they die on the vine. And unfortunately, unless we see a lot of activity happening, and Rita's doing an exceptional job with programs like GAIN, hopefully we don't see companies moving overseas or dying on the vine. So what does that mean for our future? Well, from a non-proliferation standpoint, with the decline in the U.S. commercial nuclear power industry, our voice internationally weakens. One of the ways that the U.S. has an ability to set its objectives abroad on non-proliferation matters is through a so-called Section 123 agreement. It's a bilateral agreement for nuclear cooperation between the United States and another country. If a country doesn't want nuclear reactors from the United States, it doesn't need to enter into a 123 agreement. One of these agreements doesn't need to be in place for them to procure something from Russia. And so we lose the ability to set kind of the tone, both on a global scale and then individually with a specific country on non-proliferation. We lose our geopolitical influence. One thing that I find very sobering is the fact that Egypt announced that it was going to go with Russia for a $21 billion new reactor project. A couple months after that was announced, Egypt also announced that it was going to let Russia planes and jets use their Air Force bases and fly over their country in their airspace. That's the strongest presence Russia has had in Egypt since 1973. The fact that it is a few months after it negotiated a $21 billion agreement for new nuclear reactors in Egypt is not a coincidence. With a nuclear reactor goes a lot of geopolitical influence. It's a 100-year relationship that goes for the life of the reactor. And Russia's doing it on very competitive terms that the United States is having a hard time competing with. It's being run by the Russian government, not in the United States it's Westinghouse. Westinghouse is going over and trying to sell its reactors. But then you have different operators, different contractors, people who are providing the balance of plant. It's a bunch of different companies that piece together a nuclear power plant. Russia doesn't bother with any of that. They say, we'll give you the whole thing turnkey. We will give you the operators. We will supply you with the fuel. We will take the fuel back and dispose of it in our country. And by the way, we're also going to give you a $20 billion loan with a 2% annual rate of return paid back over 30 years. Holy cow, Westinghouse can't do any of that. It can provide a reactor. And so in order for the United States to be competitive with countries like Russia, it needs to be able to step up and be able to offer more than what it's currently offering. And we're seeing a lot of those activities happen. I think, one, I suspect there's a ton of stuff going on behind the scenes that I don't know about, because again, I'm private sector. But we're seeing a lot of that start to emerge with the whole concept of the Team USA Inc., where the US government and the private sector operators and suppliers are all teaming together to try to come as close as they can to provide that turnkey package. And there's something that the United States offers that Russia doesn't. It offers the highest safety and security standards in the world. We traditionally, Russia traditionally will turn off your pipeline when it wants to, just to turn off your pipeline whenever it wants, frankly. and there's a risk with that because they will use it as a weapon. Your energy, which is essential for your independence as a country, is your autonomy, your economy, and how you run. It's basically having a constant energy source is, if you take that away, it's an existential threat for many countries. And if you have Russia providing your energy, you don't know that they're just not going to turn it off if you don't do what they want to do. The United States tends to not operate that way. And so there's a lot more safety and security that can go with having the United States supply your reactor. So that was not meant to be all doom and gloom, but I am going to end it on a super optimistic note that I'm really excited about. And this is advanced reactors. And I know, you've heard us kind of talk about the safety features of advanced reactors and the potential of advanced reactors, but maybe to put it in some context, I don't know, how many people has anybody here heard of the Breakthrough Energy Coalition? Okay, There we go. We've got a bunch of hands. So a handful of hands. So I will fill in the gaps. So the Breakthrough Energy Coalition was founded by Bill Gates. It is a collection of like the most famous CEOs in the world. It's like Mark Zuckerberg, Richard Branson, Meg Hewitt, Bill Gates, and a whole bunch of other CEOs that have individually pledged $1 billion, which is kind of a drop in the bucket when you're looking at energy innovation, but it's the thought that counts, and they're going to expand on it. And they have identified, they've created this fund, and they've created this coalition that wants to bring about energy innovation change very quickly. And what they have done is they've identified the technologies that have the ability to raise the global standard of living by providing clean, safe, affordable, and reliable electricity generation to the masses. I'm just going to repeat that again. To raise the global standard of living. That is a profound objective. And the very first technology that they identified to do that is advanced reactors. And so the ability and the potential for advanced reactors is astounding. And we have so many fantastic, innovative companies in the United States that are really looking to bring about that global change. And I think it's a really, really exciting time right now to help let them do that. So kudos to you, Rita.
No pressure.
No, no problem.
Don't ruin the world.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was great. I know that there's a lot of students in the audience here, and they're very interested in nonproliferation and geopolitical influence. And I think that nuclear, it's not just about power production. It has all these other elements to it. And I always try to get people interested in the nuclear field. They hear about it's phasing out. Why would I want to go in it? No more nuclear engineering schools, no jobs. And that's really not true. And we have to educate people better, I think. And I think that there's these dimensions that we don't really think about very often, and just as you have raised in the national security perspective, which are really, really important. So thank you for raising that. Okay, so I think we have a really interesting set of views that our panelists have offered us, and I'm going to, rather than take up time to ask the questions, I want to open the floor up to our audience here to ask our panelists questions. I ask you to please identify yourself, and if you can direct your question to a panelist, that would be helpful. But please, who is going to be the first one? Jenny.
My question, I heard George actually mention that we're like an airline industry, so that recalls the kind of, airport. So the old nuclear power plants compared to the new airport kind of, building, is there any way for you to transform by integrating the technology into a new type of state-of-art, airport type nuclear power plants, or you have to actually abandon that and build from scratch? And the costs associated with that. That's my question. Thank you.
For the present reactors, the best we really can do is go from analog system to digital systems and use big data to do more predictive maintenance and the like. That's going to get us out to 80 years of life for each of the reactors that choose to do so. But fundamentally, we need to bridge to that new small modular reactor that's safer, has a smaller footprint. The economics are just so much better for the new nuclear power plants. I think you got to build new.
Rita, do you have anything to add?
Well, one thing to add is that many of these newer companies are also looking at autonomous operation. So you wouldn't have the traditional control room that you might think of, either have been in or have seen that exists today, whether it be analog or digital. This could be something that could be operated remotely as well.
And maybe just add one little small point. That one thing that sort of bridges the gap, not hugely on the technology side of things, but advanced fuels, accident-tolerant fuels. For existing nuclear power plants, if you put a newer accident-tolerant fuel in there, it burns at a lower temperature. It can cause a power uprate. So you can get additional safety benefits from a more advanced design in a traditional fuel design in a traditional reactor.
It can be a game changer. Yeah. I mean, the amount, if you could do real accident-tolerant fuel, you could reduce the number of safety systems needed, reduce the staff, reduce the security and the like. It would be a game changer and make the present plants much more economically viable.
Oh, do you have anything to add? I love the way you said, while you were away, things have changed. Are you optimistic?
Well, I kind of, as I mentioned in my remarks, the benefits that, from a safety perspective, an accident-tolerant fuel can provide, I think that's something that the NRC should find ways to allow that to be permitted to be used in the reactors that we have today. Again, I mentioned, like, again, to me, that's a basic change. I mean, what happened at 3 Mile Island? The fuel melted. So if you have fuel in the core that can withstand higher temperatures, to me, this is a positive improvement, and it's up to the NRC to figure out how we can make sure that these advanced designs aren't going to create any other safety problems. The other thing I would point out in terms of advanced reactor development, and even what we're looking at for a design such as called NuScale, which is a small modular reactor. This NuScale reactor is maybe just a much more scaled down version of a big nuclear power plant, but it has some very, very interesting safety features associated with it. So it's not relying on lots of pumps and diesels and things like that to protect the plant if there's a problem. As actually this reactor itself sits in a big pool already, so it has a cooling source and it uses what we call natural circulation to cool the core. So, and this is really interesting too, because as I mentioned in the NRC's book of regulations, there are a lot of requirements that a large nuclear power plant has to meet in terms of how many operators have to be in the control room, how big the security force needs to be, how large the emergency planning zone around the plant needs to be. And with these new reactor designs, such as NuScale and also these advanced reactor designs, it's causing the NRC to have to rethink what is the appropriate level of safety that's required in terms of how many operators we need, how big of a security force we need, what type of emergency planning requirements, what type of safety systems are required. So these are all policy issues that our commissioners, now we have 2 in the room, that have dealt with because we've identified that such technology, again, if these improved safety benefits are going to cause the United States government to rethink what requirements are required to protect public health and safety. So what I'll say is that for technology to evolve, the regulatory system needs to evolve as well. You can't just take, these new technologies, whether it's a new nuclear power plant or a new type of fuel, and try to force fit it into the existing framework of regulations. You really got to step back and take a holistic view of what's needed for safety. And we do that best by incorporating things such as probabilistic risk assessment technology and just new ways of looking at what can go wrong, how likely is it, and what's the consequence. Because these new technologies are really changing the way we're going to look at safety.
Okay, Bob, did you want to?
Yes, first of all, Bob G., President of AE2C, I want to thank this panel for a really great discussion. Janice, thank you so much for assembling this. This has been incredibly insightful and informative. I also want to thank Commissioner David Wright for joining us too. We now have 2 NRC commissioners in our presence. That's not a quorum, so I think we're still on safe ground. So, thank you, Commissioner Burns, for being We're monitoring any interplay of discussion between the 2 of you right now.
We could talk. We have 3.
The question I have is this. Over the last couple of days, and even within the last day, there's been a convergence of some very significant developments within the U.S. nuclear energy sector that you're aware of. We've had the Sanmen Unit 1 in Sanmen, China become commercially feasible. I guess commercially operational is the terminology they use within the last few days. Today, it appears that the partners to the Vogtle plant have reached sort of a touch-and-go tentative agreement to proceed forward with the construction of the Vogtle plant in Georgia. Both sites incorporate the Westinghouse AP1000 technology. I guess the question I would pose to you is this, and I think Ho had mentioned this, in China you've got a state-owned enterprise system of financing and construction. We, on the other hand, the United States, rely largely on commercial financing and commercial build-out of our sector with the assistance of DOE loan guarantees. What does that say about where we need to be as a country towards our commitment towards nuclear energy. Does it mean that in order for U.S. technology to continue to advance, we have to find venues under a state-owned enterprise system in order to build out these systems versus our own system, which appears to be sort of sputtering, stop and go at this point? And that's an editorial comment of sorts, and I'll just throw this up as a jump ball to anyone who feels comfortable addressing it. Thank you.
Paul, maybe Amy too.
Sure. Let me take my NRC hat off and just be Ho here, just an American citizen, because I've been around the world a lot, and I spent a number of years working in Paris. I also worked in Vienna, and having seen nuclear in so many different countries, it seems to me, again, as a citizen, is that if the country can make a decision on how it wants to use nuclear in its energy framework, you can make it work, because you're looking at investments in your supply chain, but basically you're looking throughout the whole fuel cycle, front end all the way through the back end. And I think countries that have a national commitment to nuclear can make it work. I mean, it's very clear. It's clear to the industry, and it's clear to the regulators that have to regulate the technology. I mean, countries that come to mind that may not have the same system of government, such as either Russia or China, Korea, for example. Somebody in their opening remarks mentioned we forgot how to build nuclear power plants. Yeah. Okay. But I read an interesting study recently by two guys in France did a study. They said, and they said the same thing, that the reason why some of these projects such as AP1000, EPR have struggled with construction timelines and cost overruns is because we kind of forgot how to do it. They're bringing all these new people in to try to assemble these power plants, but Korea really didn't forget how to do it, and they've delivered on time, on schedule. So. And again, this is not an NRC position, so don't take it that way. But just having seen a lot of countries, I think in answer to your question, yeah, if there's a national decision made and it's clear what nuclear's role is and there's a national commitment to it, I think that's a better situation, and rather than leaving it up to the market to decide. So, thank you.
Just to reemphasize a couple of your points, the UAE, the Koreans have essentially built a plant that's ready to run before they're ready to operationally operate it. That's
right.
Where they're at. And companies like, there's companies out there that have management models that are trying to help them figure out how to start this plant up and get it going. And, our inability to build big things is not just a nuclear problem, but across the United States. If we really had to rally ourselves to respond to any national crisis and build something, it's going to be a challenge, because we have proven that our inability at BC Summer to pull that plan off really was basically our inability to manage a big project.
Amy?
So I actually think your point about financing is a very solid point. It is very difficult for U.S. companies to remain competitive on projects abroad when we can't provide that kind of turnkey, fully financed, we'll take your spent fuel. You just have one entity you need to deal with instead of a whole bunch of other ones type project that the Chinese and the Russians offer. And that, I think, is something that the U.S. industry is trying to work with the U.S. government to help create that Team USA Inc. model to go sell our reactors abroad. There's a lot that the United States can offer that the Chinese and the Russians don't offer. Jobs programs. We'll train your operators, bring them up to speed, because the Russians are planning on going in and operating them themselves. But if you can create, particularly in areas like the Middle East or, MENA, the Middle East North Africa region, where there's huge amounts of the population that need jobs, young kids that need jobs, when you can combine it with a training program and a jobs program where you can help transition, operations and supply chain activities out into a local workforce, there's a much more stronger economic incentive for pursuing that type of project. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to compete with, for a U.S. entity to compete with the Russian government offering, loans in the billions of dollars at a super low interest rate. So it's something that we just need to work on.
May I make just one other comment on the financial part? It's departing from your original question, but I think it's a point that is related to what Amy's talking about. Obviously, Russia has what we call the build, own, operate, BOO, the build, own, operate model. And I think it's met with some skepticism amongst the international community in terms of, is this a good model from a nuclear safety perspective, right? Because, now you're sort of just you're building a plant, you're supplying the people, supplying the fuel and everything, but what happens in an emergency? Who's really responsible? Who's making the decision? So those are some questions. But China's kind of interesting too, because I've seen what China's been doing in terms of getting involved in other countries' nuclear power programs. Look at the United Kingdom. I mean, they made the deal with EDF to finance Hinkley Point C, which is the EPR project. It's designed by Areva. Now they're, I think, called Orano or something like that. But it was contingent on the UK purchasing 2 reactors from China, which is an indigenous design that they're selling. They're trying to sell that reactor as well to Argentina. So again, it's just interesting what you see happening in commercial nuclear in the international market. China has a lot of resources, money, and they're willing to fund projects. Like in the case of Argentina, they're going to fund a refurbishment of some of their older CANDU units if they buy a Chinese Hualong 1 reactor. So it's just quite interesting to see what's happening. So China does have some projects in Pakistan with this design as well, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the UK, because that'll be a project that a lot of people are looking at to see if the Chinese can really build a reactor in Europe. Well, as long as the UK is considered part of Europe, but again, that's still kind of up in the air right now. So.
I would just add one comment. I heard George talk about the Koreans assisting in the build of the reactor in the UAE. I went to that plant. It's just amazing what they did in the short amount of time that they did it. But they are kind of waiting to start up, and I think they're looking for help in moving forward. I was just in Korea about a month ago, and they're very worried about their nuclear power program. They have a government that's anti-nuclear right now. And it just goes counter to everything you would think about in terms of they were able to sell overseas. They were, demonstrated to be excellent, and they were very proud of that. And the Korean nuclear community is quite worried about what's going to happen, because they're still a young country in terms of developing, and they want to build more. And how are they going to do this without nuclear? And they're worried that their young people now are not going to go into nuclear. And they asked me, well, okay, the United States went through this back in the, 1990s or 80s, we went through this slump. And they wanted to know what the model was. How do you maintain this knowledge base? And I said, well, the Department of Energy was quite innovative, and they had a lot of different training programs. They tried to keep this topic alive and well, and they offered scholarships. And so, we got through that, it seemed like. But the Koreans are quite concerned now about going forward and how they're going to manage their wherewithal, their technical know-how, and their young people in staying motivated in nuclear when the government decisions now are to early closures and no more new builds. So anyway, that was just something that I would add. Okay, another question. Please, right here.
Thank you for fascinating remarks. So thanks to everyone. The UK, geographically speaking, is part of Europe, but politically speaking, that's another matter. But my question is about public perception, because this seems to me the key, both in this country and, for example, Germany is an interesting example where they're ending their nuclear industry, and of course now dependent, as mentioned earlier, on pipelines coming from the east with gas and so on. And so public perception seems to be absolutely the heart of this, at least in most Western democracies. Not the case so much in developing countries that see they're gaining technology and other economic reasons, and they seem to be given good deals. So I'm wondering if on the developments like the advanced modular reactor and digitization and so on, that you might be able to exploit this wave of new developments to actually help change the public perception or increase the public understanding. I'm afraid it's a rather nebulous question. Someone who actually comes from the security side myself, because I was interested in what Amy had to say about that aspect. It's also in the public mind, the safety and the security side, weapons side, and others are fused in many people's minds. So I'm wondering what practical steps can be taken to build on developments which I think are encouraging. Thank you.
Right. Take a crack. So one of the things that GAIN has done with respect to public perception is change what our imagery looks like when you think of nuclear. And so for those of you taking notes, because I heard there was a test later, nuclearreimagined.org. So it's nuclearreimagined, all one word, .org is a website that contains 6 sets of nuclear reactor-related imagery. It depicts scenarios such as a remote Arctic scenario where one can now live because there's a nuclear reactor operating and providing electricity, among other things. It depicts an industrial site. It depicts a Navy yard. It depicts a desert scenario where, again, typically right now today would be uninhabited, but if we can put a reactor that's operating there, you have a whole community that can be sustained in this environment. And so what we did was we worked with Third Way and Gensler Architects to reimagine what nuclear looks like. Instead of just that pair of cooling towers that we're all used to seeing, let's think about what else nuclear can look like. So that's one piece. And the other piece that we're working on is actually a grassroots type of effort where we're going into municipalities and asking them, do they consider nuclear in their energy portfolio, yes or no? And we're finding that many of the folks are answering no. And the reason is they just don't know what's going on. So it's up to us in the nuclear industry to get back out into the communities to talk about what we're doing and why it's important and what we have to offer. I think, yes, there is a big public perception piece that has stigma attached to it. Going back to what Janice said about students and the level of enthusiasm, I speak a lot at universities, and I can tell you I have never seen such a high level of enthusiasm and passion as I do currently in the nuclear engineering student community. It is astounding. I am so tickled that folks are so passionate about this. Nuclear does have the highest paying jobs in the energy industry, so not only is the passion there, but the payoff is there as well. So I think we have a way to go on the perception piece, but I think it is not just one person's job. It is everybody's job to make sure that we're advocating in the way that's appropriate for us.
And to advocate for nuclear energy, the nuclear industry stakeholders have an organization called the Nuclear Energy Institute. They have a program called Nuclear Matters, and it's NEI.org, and it's got a great resource for lots of nuclear research and documentation and publications you could use in research or public speaking and the like.
Maybe just add to one more thing to that. And those are both great resources. Those are websites I'm literally on daily. But maybe an interesting thing about public perception would be, one, I mean, we have NRC commissioners here, and I think they will tell you right off the bat, you know, local support for any new nuclear project is absolutely essential. If you go in for your first pre-application meeting, the first question you're going to get is, have you engaged with the local community and what do they think? Because if the local community doesn't want it there, they will intervene in every licensing proceeding that you will have, not only for actual getting like an operating license, but for the duration of your facility. Every license amendment, every license transfer, every opportunity, they will intervene and it will just be a mess. And so having a supportive local community is absolutely essential. But if you look at what UAMPS is doing, UAMPS is, so they're looking at building a new scale advanced reactor design at Idaho National Laboratory. So there's a whole lot of firsts there. There's a first commercial reactor design that's going to be located at a national lab. It would be a first advanced reactor design, and UAMPS would be their first customer. UAMPS is a collection of 44 municipalities. So in order for UAMPS to move forward with the project, it has to go around and get its members to sign up for it. So all the stakeholder engagement was done literally at the local level. And you see the people that would receive power, like local like mayors, going around and advocating for UAMPS and for the NuScale reactor at INL. So the mayor of, was it the mayor or the town administrator for Idaho Falls was at the Third Way Advanced Reactor Summit, and she was super, super enthusiastic. We were actually joking that if she ever left her job as like the mayor, she was going to come and work for Third Way because she was so excited about advanced reactors from a climate change perspective, from an energy security perspective, from a resiliency perspective. And so seeing kind of local government be that excited about a project and then going out and advocating to the rest of the community is the way that it needs to be done.
I'd like to just make one observation on your question. For sure, nuclear is special. There's the connection to weapons, which I don't know if you'll ever be able to cut that connection between the two. And then it's also special in that you have these industrial accidents, transportation accidents where there is significant loss of life. Governments, authorities come in, clean it up, it's out of the news cycle in, let's say, a month. But you can have a nuclear accident or an event where nobody dies, but yet it's remembered for decades, which is really interesting. So that's one perception, of course. I guess as I was listening to your question and hearing the comments, just from reading kind of the news these days and looking at what the conversation about, I think nuclear is developing another perception, is that it costs too much. Okay, look what happened. Look at the pieces that the co-owners of, or one of the customers of the Vogtle project, they wrote this letter, pleading for the owners to vote against the project, and they made a very compelling case against the cost. But I'm reading more and more about that in the news than about the safety of the design. So if I were in the nuclear industry, I would really be thinking about that. What are we doing in terms of the messaging? Again, I'm a regulator. I'm not here to decide one way or another whether the U.S. should choose nuclear, but just reading stuff, I mean, it seems like reputationally, it sounds like the message that's getting out to the public and the people that do, that can decide whether or not nuclear has a role, is it costs too much. So just an observation there.
You had me coming out of my chair.
Yeah.
The word that drives me absolutely crazy is the bailout word. The only thing we're asking for is proper compensation for what we do for being carbon-free, our reliability, our physical security, and our cybersecurity. If you had to make gas plants, coal plants, any kind of generation as robust insofar as cybersecurity or physical security as we are, their costs would go through the roof also. And we just think we need to be compensated for that. And like we're base load at night, we don't get compensated for what it costs us to generate electricity at night. We need help with the markets, and we're working with FERC and other departments to fix that. But when I read bailouts, it just, quite frankly, it irks me. Probably figured that out, didn't you?
I'm sort of getting the signal that we have to conclude, but I see Barkley jumping out of his chair. Do you have a comment to make, or do you?
No, I had a question.
Okay.
Getting back to the U.S. situation, several of you have spoken about the supply chain situation here in the U.S. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the U.S. had the best supply chain for nuclear in the world. We had industries growing to meet the demand. Part of our problem now is the supply chain to even supply the parts for our current reactors, put aside the advanced reactors, is getting tough. We have a very restrictive quality program, both on the NRC side and on the DOE side, that make it very rigorous and very restrictive for existing companies and new companies to provide parts. Are there any thought? I mean, if you take a look, the Chinese have a different quality requirements program for all their supply, for their supply of Chinese parts. The Europeans have a different program closely related to the Chinese. We, the U.S., have a very rigorous quality requirements program, and Taiwan, which is caught kind of in the middle, Taiwan wants to supply parts to the Chinese industry, but it's tied to kind of the U.S. quality program. Are there any thoughts about trying to make our quality requirements more in line with, especially for safety-related parts, safety class and safety-related parts, something more commercial?
Okay, Ho, can you answer that quickly?
I can offer just a few thoughts, and it was actually an area I was working on at the Nuclear Energy Agency. When you're talking about quality, you ultimately get to the codes and standards that are used to manufacture the components, to what code does the material need to be qualified to, and et cetera, and so forth. And there are major codes around the world, and you probably know this. There's the ASME code, you have JSME from Japan, the AFCEN in Europe. I mean, the Chinese are kind of working on their own. So we were trying to work together to kind of get sort of a consistent framework for codes and standards. So the best we were able to accomplish, at least when I was there, was to at least do a comparison of the difference between the major codes. But from my perspective, in looking at, let's say, what China's doing, like I've been to a lot of their manufacturing facilities. I've met with all their vendors, and they've showcased the innovations that they've taken from, again, U.S. and European technology. Like, you know, it's no secret they bought AP1000, they bought EPR, and they adapted it to their own design. But from just a casual observation of their manufacturing capabilities and the products they've developed, you know, they're advertising to their potential customers that they meet the international standards. You know, they're saying that their products are, you know, built to the same specifications as codes around the world. So I can't say whether or not the quality is either above or below the line in terms of what we would ask for in the United States. But what I can say, in having seen their capabilities, I didn't see anything that struck me as being an outlier in terms of, you know, what Korea is able to produce with their components, what's able to be produced in Japan, as well as in Europe. So I think it's a great question, but I think if we can get to the point where we can harmonize the quality standard across the world in terms of codes and standards, I think that would go a great way. And since I'm on this point, I think another thing that the world could be ready for, if countries chose to do it, would be perhaps maybe being able to certify or license a new reactor design multilaterally. You know, I've looked at what countries are looking at in terms of making a licensing decision on a reactor, such as a small modular reactor, especially one that's of a light water type. We're all looking at the same functional areas. If you put aside security and emergency preparedness and environmental, from the technology perspective, we're all looking at essentially the same things. The acceptance criteria may be slightly different, but more or less, you know, I can say that what we're looking at in fuel design here in the United States and what the French are looking at, we're looking at the same issues. I mean, the fuel is a fuel. I mean, we understand how it works, and we know how to make a regulatory decision. So one of the things we were trying to do at the Nuclear Energy Agency was try to bring it to a multilateral forum where countries can license or certify a technology, you know, that would satisfy the framework and requirements of several countries. I mean, everybody looked at the aircraft industry as a model for that. You can certify a Boeing or an Airbus to meet either the FAA standards or the European aviation standards, which are the two main standards, and you can sell it anywhere in the world. So is nuclear that special where we can't do it? Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but I think it would require countries to want to do something like that. And what you would need is you would need some consistent set of codes and standards, et cetera, and so forth. So, sorry, I digressed a little bit, but that's my feeling there. So.
Thank you, Ho,
Yeah.
for that, and also for promoting the notion of the need for international collaboration. It's really important in this kind of thing, and it's not so easy either. I mean, I've been in it all my life, and it seems like, you know, it's a great idea, great concept, but to really come to agreement multilaterally is a challenge. Okay, so I'm getting the signal that I need to wrap up, unfortunately, but our panelists, we have a reception, and our panelists are still here, and I would really encourage you to come up to each and every one of them and ask your questions. I wish we had a little bit more time because this was a very, very interesting topic, and I really want to thank all the panelists, Amy, Ho, George, Rita, for your time. It was really fascinating, and I think we could just go on and on and on, but I really appreciate your time, and I really thank the audience, too, for coming today and sharing in this conversation with us on a very, very important topic. You know, nuclear continues to remain something very important for the future in not only energy production, climate change, and in preserving and protecting our national security interests. Before I conclude, I need to turn over to our officers here for some final words, and then we will adjourn to the reception. So Jenny and Trevor?
I actually had notes but basically, thank you, the panelists, for this very high quality panel. It was very interesting, and on behalf of the students, and a lot showed up between classes and everything, so it shows that this topic is very interesting to us, and especially as we learn about electricity mix and so forth. And I want to thank you, AE2C and Jenny Hu, for helping us, for us to have the honor to host this event. And I hope to have future collaboration in the future. So thank you very much.
I'm Jenny Howe, board member for AE2C. This is the first time that actually we put an official partnership actually together, but we have tried for the past 2 years, and through the tryout and collect the feedback from the Energy and Environment Club, we have actually put this partnership in kind of official ink together with the SAIS. What we try to do is by collecting the input and also the participation from the students, and also provide the best top quality industry veterans that actually sitting here discussing the international and advanced policy issues, and we do the video recording to help them build up the library for their future kind of nuclear discussion. And in the future, we're going to collect the input from the student club about the interest and topic that actually show to their future study, as well as their interests and concerns about the society in terms of the energy, environment, and international issues. So that's how we see the mutual benefit bring to the student club, as well as to our professional membership and industry participation and veterans. So thank you, everybody, and welcome to this event, and welcome to this partnership, and the reception actually is next door. So thank again. Enjoy. Thank you.